if you want to get into it, then we can just get into it.
Yeah, well, so if you want to do a little bit of an outline, I'll just go ahead and spoil our main topic of discussion here. Folks, today your hosts have been gracious enough to bring me back on to talk about something less serious than critiques of American culture. Instead, today we're going to be reviewing some common tropes in sovereign citizen nonsense and the things and stories and alleged history that the sovereign citizens draw on from conspiracy theory to justify their nonsense. So we're going to do a grand tour of ye old medieval central banking, of how the U.S. is still ruled by the British Crown actually, and how you are not in fact a citizen of a country, but rather an employee of a multinational corporation.
Oh, that sounds like a lot.
Well, we can make it as short or as long as you want to.
No.
There's a lot of material.
I'm excited about it.
No,
don't get me wrong.
I don't think he means
I'm
that
excited.
It sounds like a lot of content. I just think he means like, damn, that's heavy, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, if literally any of it were true, it would be some extremely explosive truth bombs.
Yeah.
But on that note, you also have to consider that this stuff's coming from groups like the Sovereign Citizens. This is stuff that it's been around for a long time, but it really saw a resurgence during the militia movement era. They're the mid 80s through the 90s before the feds infiltrated and shut them all down. So it's a lot of that far right, oh my God, you don't have real liberty, and here's why. I'm going to pretend to be a lawyer and yell about admiralty courts kind of stuff. Real Dale Gribble content, frankly.
I love it. I love Dale Gribble content.
So with that being said, do you guys want to go chronologically, or do you want to just follow the note sheet that I've got? Because the note sheet is not actually chronological.
We'll let you decide on that.
I was going to say that for me personally, I prefer chronological if it's not too much.
Yeah, I'll have to scooch some stuff around just so I know where I'm at, but that's why I was asking. Okay, so I guess to really get down to the root of it, how familiar are you gentlemen with William of Normandy, William the Conqueror?
I know a bit, but
Tiny
not.
bit.
Yeah.
So enough to know that he was a Anglo-Saxon duke in the French kingdom who invaded England and seized the throne, right?
Yeah.
That's as much as you need to know about William the Conqueror himself as an individual. And that was in, the mid-11th century, 1060 something.
Yeah.
But the reason this is applicable is because while he did, in fact, successfully invade England from Normandy and seize the English throne, he granted a series of special rights and special vassal status to the city of London proper. And at that time, it was a territory of just 1 square mile. Now, there's very little, and by very little, I mean no documented evidence of this, but the story goes that in addition to getting these special rights, they also financed the war debt of his conquest of England. And that is what ensured these special privileges for the city of London proper. Are we following along?
Yeah.
Yeah, like that area, that territory, and it's called formally the City of London, not just London. They still to this day have their own Lord Mayor in addition to a mayor of the metro area. And, even members of the royal family, it's perfunctory in today's day and age, but they have to ask special permission of that Lord Mayor and have a whole big to-do before they go within that 1 square mile of territory in the heart of London. So it's pretty interesting stuff.
Huh.
But again, the conspiracy angle where we're starting off here is this place exists. I mean, it does literally exist too. I'm not making that part up. But the idea is that they debt financed William of Normandy's invasion of England and therefore got their financial hooks into the English crown, extorting it for special privileges that no other vassals or territories had all throughout the High Middle Ages or through the Renaissance, and really even to this day. So that's our platform. That's where we're building from. Does that make sense, gentlemen?
Right. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So if we're all on board, now I want to go ahead and jump forward 550 years. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
Nothing important happened in between, so it's all good.
Literally nothing. Not
Literally
the
nothing.
discovery of America, not the Italian Renaissance. Nothing happened. So that brings us to the very dawn of the 17th century, which is to say the 1600s.
Okay.
Now, as you gentlemen are almost certainly aware, being the highly intelligent studs that you are, the nation of Great Britain was a very active colonizer in North America. Did you know
Yep.
that? There were British colonies here?
That's a wild revelation.
That's news. That's news to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it was to me too when I first read it. Anyways, so the way these colonies were established, right? They were established by grants from the crown. You know,
Mhm.
you formed a corporation, you got a monopoly right on a certain amount of area and, you know, X, Y, and Z mineral rights, and you had to share it with the king. Eventually, or essentially rather, they were leasing you the land for whatever because they claimed it for their own throne.
Yeah.
That brings us to King James and the Virginia Company. Now, the Virginia Company itself is actually a little bit of a misnomer because there were two sub-companies. There were two charters granted. There was the Virginia Company of London, which is going to be more relevant for our discussions, but also the Virginia Company of Plymouth. A direct quote from these charters that they should divide themselves into two colonies, the one consisting of divers, knights, gentlemen, merchants, and others of our city of London. Now, before we get any deeper here, based on what I've already told you guys, does anything in that grant spark a neuron for you? Put on your
okay.
thinking
One
hat,
question.
Zero.
Not yet.
One question that I had is, you're talking about these two companies. They're both Virginia companies, and one is of London and one is of Plymouth. Now, I've heard of the Plymouth Company. Is that the same thing, or is that something separate?
It is the same thing. Yeah, it's the Virginia Company of Plymouth that founded the Plymouth Colony.
Okay. Yeah, I've only ever heard it referred to as the Plymouth Company, so that's new to me.
So the reason I was asking is because that little brief statement from the charter specifically references of our city of London.
Right.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Now, moving on. This was initially not an extremely profitable venture for the British Crown.
Mhm.
You know, as fate would have it, when they wound up here, they ran into all sorts of trouble, first establishing the colony and then finding literally anything worth growing. They showed up here thinking they were going to find silver and gold mines all over the place, like the Spanish had already been doing for 100 years.
Mhm.
And they just didn't. You know, as it turns out, coastal Virginia isn't laden with gold mines. Shocking. So, King James, though, being the low time preference monarch that he is, continued to expand their territorial rights, continued to invest resources into this Virginia company, along with various private investors, I might add. It was not solely a crown project at this particular point. Now, sorry, I had to light a cigarette.
No problem.
This was all in 1607. In 1609 and in 1612, the charter, and therefore territory afforded specifically to the London Company, was expanded, both east and west. The direct quote is from sea to sea.
Okay.
Now, at a certain point, though, they just failed their mandate. They couldn't make it work. Even after they started growing sweet tobacco, there just was not enough money in it. So the Virginia Company of the City of London was revoked. It had its charter pulled, and it became a direct royal colony.
Right, yeah.
Now, that does not mean, well, hold on. I had a note for this too I wanted to read for you guys. There was a gentleman, I should have written down his first name. His last name was Smith. He was an auditor for the city of London. He was an adventurer. He was a merchantman. He made his money in the fur guilds initially. And during this whole mess with the Virginia Company of the City of London, he eventually ended up being tried for financial crimes right before the charter was revoked. So this guy in leadership, he basically was the fall guy for the failure of the colony, and none of the other colonial leadership was.
Okay.
Now, I just want to emphasize that because the point being is that there's still a corporate structure in place here, right? Just because the CEO got sacked doesn't mean the rest of the structure went away. The king just revoked the lease and brought it under personal control.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Now, this is going to be relevant because I'm going to jump ahead further in time here yet again, if you guys don't mind.
Go for it.
Absolutely.
We're going to the American Revolution, and specifically to the peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris, that ended the American Revolution. I would like to make a direct quote from it. Or, no, rather, this is a quote from someone talking about Article 5 of the Treaty of Paris. After America declared independence from Great Britain, the Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3rd, 1783, was signed. That treaty identifies the King of England as the Prince of the U.S. And here's the direct quote. The treaty was addressed to him, the monarch, as Prince George III, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, Duke of Brunswick and Lunenburg, Arch-Treasurer and Prince-Elector of the Holy Roman Empire, etc., and of the United States.
Oh.
Wow.
Yes, and that list of signatures and titles is, like I said, in Article 5 of the Treaty of Paris that concluded the American Revolution.
That is pretty wild.
We have this direct corporate charter under the control of the Crown that became the basis for Virginia and the 13 colonies, along with the charter for Plymouth. Time goes by. America decides that, hey, we're sick of the taxation that's being levied on us. We're sick of kicking back all of this stuff to the king. We're sick of paying our dues to the city of London. So we're going to throw off this yoke. They do. They win their War of Independence. And now all of a sudden, and of the United States of America. So time goes on. The U.S. has its own government. We're doing our thing here in North and South America. We're expanding. We're continuing to build. And, 1812 comes along. Or, you know what? Let me back up just a moment. Before I get to 1812, we should talk about the first bank of the United States, right?
Yeah.
So, as we know, a good portion of the founding fathers were against the concept of a national bank, against the concept of proto-central banks, because there were only a few in the world at that point. And, they weren't all about that. Most of them hated banking in general. But Alexander Hamilton didn't.
Our boy.
And against the advice of others, Hamilton was able to persuade Washington to throw his political weight behind this and set one up. So they issued $10 million worth of stock to finance this national bank. $2 million would be bought directly by the U.S. government, which of course it didn't actually have, but that's money magic. Yeah. That's bullshit. But the remaining $8 million worth of stock to charter this for capital was available to purchase by anyone, not just America, but any foreign investor who wanted to get in on the bonds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the central bank does its thing. It's up and running. And predictably, it's an absolute shit show. Of course, it doesn't work like it was intended to. They never do. We can jerk off about Austrian economics and the calculation problem and inflation and a million other things. But the point is, they issued all this stock. They sold off the rights to the U.S.'s first central bank, and it just didn't work.
Yeah.
The good news is, though, this bank had a charter for a specific length of time, from 1791 to 1811, at which time that charter lapsed and it was not renewed. The colonists had learned their lesson, or rather not colonists anymore, the Americans had learned their lesson, and they were just done with it.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the War of 1812. Now, most people, most reasonable historians have concluded that the War of 1812 was fought over a number of economic factors and over the impressment of U.S. sailors, right? The British were literally jacking our merchant ships and deciding, hey, you need to come work on this Royal Navy ship because we captured you at sea.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But we very seldomly discuss those actual economic factors, right?
Yeah, correct.
The economic angle of the War of 1812 was primarily about embargoes and trading rights.
Yeah, it was mostly New England merchants, right, that were behind it. No,
Absolutely.
I got okay, did I get that right? Okay.
You know, and the reason this is important is because the British did not want American merchants selling to Napoleon. Britain was by far our largest trading partner.
Yeah.
80% of the American cotton crop was going to Great Britain at that time, and 50% of all other American exports. You know, they had a stranglehold over our export-import here. Now, the reason it's important, and the reason I put that on the note sheet, is so that people understand the financial dependence of the U.S. And not just the financial dependence of the U.S., but the reason those numbers look the way they do. You see, to rewind very briefly to the Virginia Company, in the charter, the Crown was owed 50% of all mineral goods and 5% of all business profits. Now, what number did I just cite about American exports going to Great Britain?
The 50%.
Yes.
Hmm.
So, the War of 1812 gets ginned up, and we're beefing with Great Britain again. The American government doesn't like what they're doing to our trade situation. They don't like that they're trying to embargo our goods and stop us from selling what's left to other places. Now, this is where things can see a little divergence. At this point, you're going to see a split in the camps among the sort of fringe right conspiracy theorists who love to talk about this stuff. Some of them will tell you that America was fully independent at this time, that they were fighting this war for those exact reasons. They were trying to finish breaking the yoke of British influence. But others will tell you that this is the first example of the infamous Rothschild family funding both sides of a war. Now, there's a quote that likes to float around the internet of the, at that time, current head of the Rothschilds family, telling the Prime Minister of Great Britain that the Americans needed to be brought back in line with the Crown. No one has ever been able to produce a letter or a witness statement or a diary entry of him saying anything of the kind. It's just attributed to him. Should be easy enough to dismiss, makes sense, okay. But the interesting thing that allows them to keep going and gives them a little juice with this is that the Prime Minister at the time did not want to go to war with the United States. And as such, he became the only British Prime Minister to have been assassinated while still in office. And wouldn't you know it, the next Prime Minister was all about going to war with America.
Wow, okay.
Wow.
What was his name?
That Prime Minister?
Yeah, I don't know if you have it off the top of your head or not.
I did not write it on the note sheet. It was Stephen P. something.
Okay.
You could probably, you know what? Actually, if you'll bear with me just a moment, I'll just Google it quick for you.
Okay, cool.
That is an important name. I should have wrote that down. You caught me sleeping there.
Stephen No, wait. That's not it.
Let's see. Spencer Percival. I was right. I was wrong. It wasn't Stephen. It was Spencer Percival.
Okay.
So Spencer Percival gets assassinated. He didn't want to fight the U.S. New guy rolls in, and all of a sudden it's beefing time. Now, it's also important to note that this is literally the year after that the first bank of the U.S. had its charter lapsed.
Yeah.
So there is massive outstanding debt and stock owed to all these foreign investors that just got jobbed because the U.S. was obviously still running a deficit. It never actually paid back any of those initial stock bonds that funded the first U.S. bank.
Oh, okay.
So the war, you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, I just, I thought I had remembered hearing that the U.S. had paid back its war debts with, or at least quite a bit of them with Hamilton as like Secretary of the Treasury. But,
sure,
you know.
the war debt, but not the national deficit, not the national debt.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that makes sense then. Yeah.
And so the War of 1812 concludes. You know, D.C. has been put to the torch. Jackson beat up a whole bunch of people down in New Orleans.
Yeah.
And everything's good. You know, both sides get to act like they won. Napoleon's been handled on the continent. And wouldn't you know it, you're back in business with another U.S. national bank because the U.S. lent itself into another war debt hole. Very cool, right?
Yeah.
And once you know it, the second one ended up privately financed too.
Imagine that.
Okay. And now we can actually go a few different ways from here. Let's just stick with the timeline, and then I'll talk a little bit about ancillary concerns and other things they talk about, all right?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So the War of 1812 has wrapped up. The U.S. is doing its thing. You know, we bully Mexico a little bit. We vassalize Texas, no matter what they might say. And we decide to fight ourselves a little civil war because we couldn't have just done the moral thing the first time.
Yeah, right.
And so the Civil War concludes. Very nice. Well, now we're in an even bigger debt hole. We've got things like greenbacks floating around. We've got worthless federal currency. And we also have a nation that really, really needs more money. It needs time to rebuild itself. And we've got legislature flying left, right, and center. We've got new constitutional amendments. We've got the Reconstruction Acts. And we also have a little something. Oh, shit. So maybe that's the part of this file that got corrupted. Okay. We also have a little something called the Act of 1871. And what this did is this established D.C. as the D.C. we know of it today. And territory of, you know, X number of miles, a set jurisdiction that is its own entity as the seat of the government. And this is where the sovereign citizens and their ilk love to wig out. This is one of three major linchpins of their entire argument. They assert that because DC was incorporated, that it was a business-like entity unto itself, and that because of this, because the U.S. was set up as the United States Corporation, that all citizens were now also employees of said United States Corporation instead of just being the free individuals that sovereign citizens consider themselves to be.
Wait, okay, so just I want to make sure that I understand this. You're saying that because each of the original 13 colonies were set up like corporations. That's why that's why they say that the US as a whole is.
Well, so I will absolutely clarify this for you because it's important to understand that this is where a lot of their argument falls apart, and this is where you see the two distinct camps. Some of them believe that we never left the corporate structure and that we have always been an explicit business of the British Crown because we never actually renounced our loyalty to them, as cited in the Treaty of Paris at the conclusion of the American Revolution.
Right,
And
where
the
he was
other,
lit. Yeah, I
where
was just
he
going to
was
say,
listed.
right, where, yeah, right, okay.
But the other camp of them claim that we were fully independent until this event that I'm talking about in 1871, where we had just racked up so much more war debt that we sold ourselves out by creating a U.S. corporation as our capital. These are two very different schools of thought, and many of these fringe right conspiracy thinkers hold these two ideas in no tension whatsoever. And, that's literally fine. I'm not here to tell them what to believe. I'm just relating the story for you and your audience, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 1871 comes along. There's now a literal United States corporation. And once you know it, it's in D.C. and has its own federal act that allows it to treat itself however it would like. Now, they draw the connection here to this being essentially an American branch office of said city of London, the one that I talked about in the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they make this claim because the idea is in this city of London, in this 1 square mile, it is also known, even in our era today, it's known as a tax haven, right? Because it has so many special privileges under the British legal system. And as such, many law firms, international banks, and et cetera, super suspect organizations all park their headquarters there to take advantage of those special privileges.
Okay, yeah.
Their contention, this sort of fringe right contention, is that these organizations, these private banks, these special interests, if you will, in conjunction with the British Crown, then chose to buy up as much American debt as they could, and they used it to essentially buy out the United States corporation. And again, this is where you have to see that these two theories are in a little bit of tension, because either the United States was already still explicitly owned or it wasn't. You kind of got to pick one, but many of the people who get super into this theory, they just refuse to.
Yeah.
The next point, though, that's the end of the chronology. I could go a lot further. There's stuff on this sort of topic and school of thought that comes up with Roosevelt, comes up with the Social Security Act. But there's another bigger component that I want to cover with you guys before you have to run zero, so that you've got a chance to kind of discuss it with us.
Yeah.
The third major plank, right? I talked about there being three real big planks here. That is to say, the proto-central banks and the purchase of the United States government through debt. That is the continued vassalization of the United States through the Virginia Company and our refusal to renounce the British Crown. And the third major plank is what's called the quote-unquote Lost 13th Amendment. Now, are you gentlemen familiar with this at all? Have you heard about it? It made a minor resurgence during the Tea Party era.
No, I'm unfamiliar with it.
Okay, so as you might know, the United States Constitution is super picky about people who have titles of nobility, right?
Yeah, that's strictly forbidden, right?
Well, it's strictly forbidden, but there's no enforcement mechanism to it, right?
No, yeah, that's true.
And as such, in the early 1810s, in the very early 19th century, Congress set about to rectify that. They proposed and sent out to the states an amendment that would strip the citizenship of people who held titles of nobility.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, this is still technically tabled for the states to discuss and ratify. It passed Congress, it's out to the states. In our modern day and age, amendments have a statute of limitations to be considered. Because this one was grandfathered in, it is still available for active consideration, but no one's talking about it because most of the world views titles of nobility as an antiquated, outdated concept that don't actually mean anything. You know, they're perfunctory, where they still exist at all, they're honorary.
Yeah. So, okay. So currently in the United States government, the way it works is that if an amendment is proposed and it passes both houses and it's sent out to the states, it only has a certain amount of time to be ratified. But like in that day and age, that wasn't the case.
Correct.
Okay. Wow.
And so this proposed, at that time, it would have been the 13th Amendment. Obviously, that would no longer be the case if it somehow passed tomorrow by some weird freak accident. But at the time, it would have been the 13th Amendment.
Yeah.
It was ratified by 10 states and rejected by 2, with 5 left for consideration. It needed 1 more to pass. But then the War of 1812, there's that war again, broke out, and people just couldn't be bothered to think about it. There was literally just too much else going on.
Yeah.
We come back, Virginia is still debating it, and we are told that Virginia just lost its response in the mail. That we don't know if Virginia approved or failed to approve it. And since then, we've added more states, we've added more territories, and so it's just not on the books.
Yeah.
Now, the sovereign citizens and the fringe right conspiracy theorists think this is extremely important because their contention is that one of their researchers back in the 80s found proof that the Virginia Congress, that the legislation of the state of Virginia had ratified it, and that the federal government had intentionally lost their response so that it would not have to be ratified.
Oh.
And what's their, like, where do they get the idea that it was intentionally lost?
I'm glad you asked that because that's what I was about to dive into next here.
Okay.
And this will be the last kind of conversation point, the last portion of the lecture before I ask you two to join me in general discussion of the topic.
Okay.
So they think this is important because of what is today considered to be an honorary title, and that is the title of Esquire.
Okay.
Yeah. Most of us don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
So this was an actual noble title, and it was used as such for a very long time, literally hundreds of years, right? We see it first formally defined in the 1500s, though it had been in use long before that. Now, if I may quote from a style guide here from the 16th century, this is a style guide about when it is appropriate to use esquire and what this rank of nobility means. The title should be limited to those only who bear an office of trust under the crown and who are styled esquires by the king in their commissions and appointments, and all, I conceive, who are once honored by the king with the title of esquire have a right to that distinction for life. Now, in this quote, especially at that time that that style guide was conceived, crown is generally understood to be the office, the person of the British kingship.
Yeah.
But this is legally murky because there is a crown corporation that has operated out of the city of London for hundreds of years itself.
Oh.
Wow, okay.
And so, if you have the title of a squire, if you have been graced with it, either through the International Bar Association, which is headquartered in the city of London, or if you have been granted that title by the king, you are understood to bear an office of trust under the crown. Now, gentlemen, do you suspect that there were a great number of lawyers among the Founding Fathers' generation and in the early federal government? Now, do you think it's possible that they were members of the Bar Association and had been granted the noble title of a squire, whether it was landed or not?
That is more than possible.
I think that's a fair assessment, being more than possible.
Yeah.
And so, if this proposed amendment would have stripped holders of noble titles of their citizenship, what would happen to all these esquires?
Yeah, they'd lose their titles. And what else here? I'm trying to go back in these notes here. Yeah, so you wouldn't be able to hold an office of public trust without consent of Congress.
Correct. And so, once again, that is the linchpin of the sovereign citizen and that sort of far-right conspiracy school's line of thinking, is that lawyers literally are not legally allowed to hold office in the U.S. because they are understood to be explicit and implicit agents of the British Crown.
Wow. Okay.
And now, like I said, I did not include on this note sheet stuff going forward past the U.S. corporation and the Act of 1871 because I wanted to be time sensitive, and I really wanted to sort of let you guys talk with me about it.
Hey, everyone. So we're recording without Cotton because our first recording session got interrupted with some internet issues, and then when we rescheduled, Cotton was not able to join us. But what we really want to do here is kind of clear up some questions that we have about this topic that maybe weren't clear, or we just have questions about from that first discussion. So anyway, welcome back, Dexter.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So the first question that I have is, do most sovereign citizens think that we are employees of a certain corporation? And if so, what corporation or corporations would that be?
Yeah, so that gets really to the root of one of their core beliefs. The sovereign citizen opinion, in the majority of them who take the time to do their quote-unquote research, because we know how bad the internet research can go when you do it the wrong way.
Right.
Many of them have come to the conclusion that the U.S. corporation, 1871, that was the incorporation of Washington, D.C., and many of these types take it to be the establishment of a literal U.S. corporation, a holding company for the entire United States, so that the British Crown or the international bankers or the Illuminati or even the Vatican, whatever their personal bugaboo or boogeyman of choice is, could plunder and loot the U.S. through our tax code. And they take the Social Security number that we are assigned at birth as proof that we are actually employees of this said U.S. corporation and not actual citizens of a sovereign nation. And that gets into all sorts of fun beliefs they have about whether or not you can sue the U.S. for the grand sum total of the money in your Social Security account, and just a bunch of other wacky financial legal shenanigans that make up the YouTube compilations we so much love to see of their shenanigans. But yeah, they believe that every U.S. citizen, by having a social security number, is basically a slave employee to the U.S. corporation.
Okay. And then for the ones that think that we, like our ultimate allegiance is the British crown, why do they think that?
They come to that conclusion based on the idea that the Virginia Company, as chartered by King James, never actually dissolved. And based on the boundaries he drew for it among his lands and properties in North America, going back to the 1600s when it was established, they claim that those borders were ambiguous enough that virtually the entire U.S. continental area, the lower 48, are within it, and that by being born here, we are colonial employees of the Virginia Company. And that's how they reach that conclusion.
Right, because a lot of those charters, they would give you like a north and south border, but then in terms of going west, like they just didn't even know how far it went.
Right, so those borders wouldn't be fixed. And then naturally, by those conclusions, the Virginia Company would have authority from where it was founded, in Virginia, all the way to the West Coast.
Yeah.
And, maybe in 17th century legalism, that might actually hold up. That's not the world we live in today. But they're of the opinion that because it was in continuous operation and never technically folded and is still a possession, the Virginia Company being a possession of the British Royal Crown, that we therefore must be owned by the British Crown.
Yeah.
Again, this is all in their algebra, not necessarily ours.
Yeah, right. And then in terms of the War of 1812, sovereign citizens have different opinions on that and what actually happened there. Can you go into that?
Yeah, so that's going to go back to the whole idea that it's kind of up to whichever boogeyman they choose to make the villain of their story. Some of them will say that because the U.S. National Bank folded let me take a deep breath here, because the U.S.'s first central bank folded right before that war started. They take that as proof that was our actual independence from Britain, and that the War of 1812 was the real revolution, because we no longer owed money to them via the Virginia Company or via their investment in our national bank. Now, some of them would also claim that the fact that it ended in a stalemate means it was more renegotiating of terms between the Virginia Company, i.e. the U.S., and the British Crown for more rights over their own land here in America. And now some people would also say that it was just a sham and that the War of 1812 really made no difference and that they remained British subjects this entire time. So again, there's a lot of sub-factions at play here. Some people think 1812 was the real revolution. Some of them think it was just for show. And some people think it was a renegotiating of terms between the U.S. and the British without actually affecting American independence.
Okay, now in terms of how things are done today, if a company owns something, generally that's a matter of public record. So if a corporation like the Virginia Company did own like the entire United States, that should be like public record, correct? So what can they point to a company that they think is just like a renamed Virginia Company, or do they have like a reason for why it's like a secret, I guess?
Yeah, so I want to preface this one here with, I am not a lawyer. Now, with that being said, their claim is based on what more or less boils down to legal mumbo jumbo, as near as I can tell. But their claim is that through a very careful examination of documents, you will find in some specific legislation, laws, regulations, documentation, etc., etc., etc. In some documents, the United States is capitalized with only the U and the S, whereas in other documents, it is all capitalized and in boldface. They will point to this second instance as occasions when it is talking about their diabolical holding company for the Illuminati or the British Crown or whoever their villain is, with the mere capitalization of the U and the S referring to the physical territory and the people living therein. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And their claim is that that matters a great deal in contract law because it very clearly delineates two different beings. Now, I think we can see from their track record that that argument doesn't actually hold up in court either. But when you're of these opinions, it's also very easy to dismiss that fact as, well, obviously it's rigged. We can't have the truth getting out.
Right. Now, I think most of us are most familiar with sovereign citizens from like YouTube videos where they're arguing with cops during a traffic stop.
Yes, and I've got to just say, just real quick, I absolutely love those compilations, though. They are hilarious.
So, like, I guess what are their main arguments when they get into these like traffic stops? So, like, why? Like, what do they tell the cops that they think will convince the cops that they're free to go and basically unable to be detained, etc.?
So a lot of their arguments boil down to all of them thinking that they are somehow legal experts in their own right and trying to play on very specific language and contorting said language to mean something that's nowhere else in the history of U.S. legal precedent at this point, you know?
Yeah.
They want to say, oh, this action constitutes this other thing, which is, you know, a guaranteed right of mine. You hear it the most with traveling versus driving, and therefore they don't need a license.
Right.
And such things. So it all boils down to, again, the magical legal algebra they try and do in their own heads because they've watched 4 or 5 YouTube videos and, you know, read a book by frickin' LaRoche or something.
Now, how would they view cops? Do they think that the cops are in on this? And, you know, once they, you know, let them know that, oh, I know what's going on here, the cops will just back off? Or do they think the cops are okay?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. They are convinced that these cops are legal scholars in their own right, and that by invoking these perfectly worded arguments, they'll get their magic pass to go on their way, which I think is pretty foolhardy, even on its face, because that would imply a scale of conspiracy that's unsustainable. And if I can tangent on that thought for just a moment, I would encourage all listeners, you know, when you're doing your own research on a topic you think's funny or interesting, or when you're hearing me talk about something and you're unclear about what I'm trying to get at, always keep in mind the problem of scaling, right? Because I do think that things can be organized globally in terms of a conspiracy. I don't doubt that for a second. But you can only have so many conspirators before anything becomes completely non-viable. So if it seems like there just might be too many people involved in a plot, there certainly is, and you're just on the wrong track.
Yeah, for sure. If
it takes too many people to work, it just won't work.
Yeah. If it involves cops, then at that point, I think you're sunk, right? So
yeah, you're giving them a little too much credit.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think just on this very specific topic, you know, I just want to again point out, like I literally just did, these people and these school of thoughts are an excellent example of why it's important to not just do research, but to do quality research.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can all fall down rabbit holes, and Lord knows I actually love doing it. That's how I've attained the niche that I have. But at the same time, if your information isn't good information, you are going to become the laughing stock crackpot that everyone thinks that every conspiracy theorist is.
Right.
So, it's not just about discovering the facts pertinent to whatever project you're working on. You also need the context for these things. You know what I'm saying?
And that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, these people, they don't study legal precedents. They don't follow really deep history, only history as it applies to what they're trying to talk about, and that leads to contorted understandings. So, folks, we're going to laugh at this one, but as I'd always say, don't laugh at every conspiracy, because there's a lot of fucked up shit out there, and it's on us to know the difference. It's on us to get it right, because Lord knows the media won't, the politicians won't, nobody will. And that goes back to my first appearance with you guys on Dissecting Liberty too. You need to homestead your own mind, and you don't want to sow bad seeds in your think meat, right?
That's right. All right. Well, you want to give your plugs real quick before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'd love to. The main one is find me on Twitter at DogmanRespecter. That's where I do the majority of my work. Find me at The Gaslight Hour. That's my primary podcast. I'm one of the main hosts there. And, check me out on other in-group shows. I've been on most of them, and I'm willing to go on more. So if you're looking to book a guest who's a little bit off the beaten path, or if you just want to have a conversation with me, don't be shy.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on. It was a pleasure as always. And were you going to say something?
I was just going to say thanks for having me. Thank you so much. I love talking to you and Cotton. You guys are great. Well,
the feeling is mutual. And I don't know if I'm going to do my regular outro because Cotton's not here. But thanks everyone for listening, and see you soon.